So as Pete said, it's such an honor to be here today, and I'm going to provide an overview of metabolism disruptors focusing on obesity. So let me start this by setting the stage a little bit. You heard Pete talk about the Wingspread Symposium and the word endocrine disruptor. And that started the field. And the focus then was on chemicals that had estrogenic, androgenic, or thyroid activity. That meant we were focusing on reproduction or neurodevelopment and neurobiology. And the field focused on that for quite a few years until early 2000, when a very interesting article came out called Chemical Toxins, a Hypothesis to Explain the Global Obesity Epidemic. That was the very first paper that talked about toxins and obesity. And then a few years later, the terms obesogen and the terms diabetogen were termed. And then there were quite a few meetings over the next few years on metabolic disruptors, metabolism disruptors, and now just in the next few weeks a paper will come out on the key characteristics of metabolism disruptors. So if you talk about metabolism disruptors, that field really is only 10 years or so old. But why did it change? Why did we get a focus on obesity? And the reason is there was such a huge increase in obesity. Not only, does this work? Yes. In the United States, in adults, and in children, and in 6-month-old babies, but also across the globe. And this increase occurred in the last 50 years or so. So what causes obesity anyway? So genetics certainly plays a role. Your genetic background is important, but genetics is not responsible for the increase in the last 50 years. There's some change has taken place in energy intake and energy expenditure ratio. And that comes from changes in the environment. And of course, everybody focuses there on the diet. We all know if you overeat, you put on weight. But it's just not that simple. And I'm going to talk about environmental chemicals and the role that they play in that. So let me define the term metabolism disruptors that we're talking about. These are environmental agents that alter energy metabolism. They disrupt these signaling pathways of hormones that control metabolism, that control weight gain and diabetes. So these kind of chemicals can be natural. There are viruses and metals that are metabolism disruptors. They can be drugs or environmental chemicals, or even food components, and I'll focus on the last two. And many of these metabolism disruptors are endocrine disruptors that you just heard Pete talk about. So as Pete already mentioned, these are chemicals designed for some specific purpose, like a pesticide, but they have a side effect that they mimic or antagonize your hormones, disrupting the normal hormone pathways. So endocrine disruptor is the general term. And then if you look at chemicals that are endocrine disruptors that focus on causing obesity or diabetes, that's a subset we call metabolism disruptors. This whole metabolic system is very highly controlled and organized and orchestrated by a variety of hormones. You can see all the different tissues and all the hormones going back and forth between the tissues, and eventually it ends up in the brain that coordinates all of those hormone signals, and that controls then your appetite and satiety, and another part of the brain then controls cravings or addiction or emotional eating. That's the part that I know the best, the emotional eating part. So the question then is, are we really exposed to a variety of endocrine disrupting chemicals or metabolism disruptors? And the answer is absolutely. If you just look in cord blood, human cord blood, you can find nearly 300 of these environmental chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And every pregnant woman has a variety of them, and you can also find them in breast milk. So they're everywhere, and we're all exposed. So whenever we're exposed to these metabolism disruptors, they can disrupt these hormone pathways that I showed you on that previous slide. But it turns out there is one time in your lifespan that's extra sensitive to the action of these metabolism disruptors, and that's called the developmental origins of health and disease. That says that development, the time that tissues are forming, is the most sensitive time for them to be disrupted. And it makes perfect sense, right? Hormones are controlling the differentiation of these tissues by turning genes on and off, so you get a normal fat cell. But if there are these metabolism-disrupting chemicals there, they can disrupt that signal, give you an abnormal cell, which has abnormal gene expression. So it's metabolically abnormal. Those effects then last throughout your lifetime, and the effects then can show up at a variety of different times, giving you an increased prevalence of disease, increased sensitivity or susceptibility to one of these metabolic diseases. We call that a bad start, then lasts a lifetime. So what kind of chemicals are metabolism-disrupting chemicals? Let's see if I can do this without going crazy. So one of them is the bisphenols. Bisphenols are in canned foods, plastic bags, and they come out of food packaging into the food. Another area are phthalates. They're found in cosmetics and personal care products, plastic bags. They also leach out of packaging into foods. And the third one here is these perfluorinated chemicals in non-stick coatings. They are also leaching out of food packaging into the food. And then there are a variety of other ones, including flame retardants over on the left, and parabens, which are preservatives in food and pharmaceutical products. So there's a wide variety, and these are just some of the main ones. So let's go back to diet, because everyone wants to focus. Diet is what's responsible for the weight gain. Well, in some regards, it really is playing a major role. In the 1950s and 60s, we had a different diet, at least in the United States, and hardly anybody was overweight. Now we have what's called this Western diet, this ultra-processed food diet. High fat, high sugar, high salt, low fiber, lacking fruits and vegetables. And this diet is very addictive. This diet, just by eating it, puts on weight. Eating this diet compared to other diets, you will gain more weight. You'll have an altered microbiome. you will have a variety of other diseases showing up thanks to the food industry and this Western diet, which is now not only prevalent in the United States, but is going around the world. Now, so that's not the whole story. Guess what? This Western diet is full of toxic chemicals that also put on weight. I already told you about the bisphenol, phthalates, and perfluorinated chemicals that are obesogens. They're leaching from the packaging into the food. You have fructose and non-nutritive sweeteners that are put on weight, parabens, and then those long, complicated name things that you see on all the packages. Those are food additives, preservatives. They're also obesogenic chemicals. And the dyes, the food coloring, and then on top of that, if you do eat fruits and vegetables, they're contaminated by the pesticides you spray on it. So you can see you're getting a real double whammy here. The diet itself is bad, and then you get all of these obesogenic chemicals in it. And then, of course, you get obesogenic chemicals from a variety of other sources, not just from the diet. So if we go back to this slide, obesogens act at every one of these tissues and pathways. So they can affect the adipose tissue, the pancreas, they affect the microbiome, the gut, the liver, and they can control your eating, and they control food addiction and craving. And we have different ones affecting different pathways. And that shows up here. You see the list of the different obesogens and the pathways that they affect. And what's so interesting is not only they affect all of these different pathways and tissues, but look at BPA and phthalates, the ones that are leaching out into your food. They are affecting every one of these different endpoints and different tissues, including satiety and food intake. So we have a lot of chemicals affecting a lot of pathways, and they're interacting, causing increased weight gain. But these metabolism disruptors do more than cause weight gain, as you're going to hear in a minute. They also cause not just obesity, but diabetes.
Thank you. It is an honor for me to be here too and to share this talk with Jerry Heindel, of course. So the problem with diabetes is that obesity drives to this cycle here. So it produces hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. That this insulin resistance makes more hyperinsulinemia from the pancreatic beta cell that releases insulin, and that produces more insulin resistance until a moment in which the beta cells are overworking and they stop producing and releasing insulin and they die. And then we become diabetic. And diabetes is a big problem at the moment. The figures of diabetes are epidemic and are growing with non-stop growing increase. And this causes a high suffering for our patients and also for our economy. As you can see here, the figure has grown enormously in the last 15 years. So what can we do to try to decrease these figures and the number of diabetic people, which is higher than 10% in the world, actually? So that we can do is try to understand how type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes as well are produced and what are the factors driving to this epidemic of diabetes. And this is an association, of course, but this is a nice association between chemical production and the diabetes prevalence in the last year. And of course, association doesn't demonstrate causation, but this is what we need to demonstrate, mostly using animal models. There are also many epidemiological studies associating exposure to endocrine disruptors and diabetes as well. So how diabetes is produced? Mainly type 2 diabetes, which is the 90-95% of diabetic people has this type 2 diabetes. Well, it's a matter of these two parameters: insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissue and the pancreatic beta cell function and beta cell mass. And what did happen is this. This is the normal glycemia, and here we have insulin sensitivity and insulin secretion. So when insulin sensitivity decreases with age, obesity, and many other factors, as endocrine disruptor exposure, the pancreatic beta cell adapts and start increasing insulin secretion, as you can see here, and everything is normal until the beta cell collapses. And then they stop releasing insulin, they die, and we become diabetic. So diabetes is mainly a problem of the pancreatic beta cell. And it happens in physiological states such as puberty and pregnancy, and steroid hormones, including estrogens, have an important role here. So they produce in humans increase in insulin release, a decrease in insulin sensitivity. And the glucose is normal during pregnancy and during puberty. And this is the same that happens during obesity for many years until the beta cell collapses. Okay? And we and others now have demonstrated that some endocrine disruptors do exactly the same as obesity or pregnancy or puberty. For instance, bisphenol A, by acting through estrogen receptors. They produce higher insulin release, producing hyperinsulinemia, and decreases insulin sensitivity in mice. So are really risk factors for type 2 diabetes. And the problem with all these 20 years of research is not only BPA doing that. There are many endocrine disruptors producing the same effects, as you can see in this review by Rob Sargis and Rebecca Simons for a few years ago, summarizing all the endocrine disruptors that affects the beta cell function and beta cell mass and affect insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity, as you can see here. And now we know better what are the mechanisms for that. For instance, in the pancreatic beta cell, this is how the beta cell works. Glucose enters in the cell, is metabolized, produces ATP, and this makes an electrical activity of the cell, like in neurons, producing a calcium pattern that produces the insulin release. And at the same time, there is gene expression to produce insulin synthesis and to maintain the beta cell as it is. And the point is that all these endocrine disruptors, including many in food packaging, such as bisphenol A, phthalates, PFAS, etc., are affecting every pathway involved in the pancreatic beta cell function and pancreatic beta cell viability, survival as well. And this is a problem. And not only for the pancreatic beta cell, for other cells that are well known. This is the axis that is well known in research. This is the liver cells, hepatocytes, and the adipocytes. So insulin release is going to be affected, but also what insulin does in these two cells. And at the same time, all the chemicals that I show mostly are affecting all these pathways. This is the lipogenesis, and this is one of the main key transcription factors involved, SREBP1C, which control lipogenesis and is controlled by many diseases. And they also affect the activity of all these enzymes here. So at the very end, through these mechanisms, there is a change in leptin, adiponectin, and other adipokines release. And the final is we need to see this as all together. So we are exposed like to many chemicals at the same time, affecting all these pathways at the very same time as well. So the result is an inflammation, insulin resistance, fatty liver, dyslipidemia, and all the characteristics of the metabolic syndrome. And we know how this is done. So in summary, we know that obesity and type 2 diabetes are continuously increasing. We know that the exposure to NDCs, to metabolism disruptors during development and also during adulthood, don't forget adulthood, and pregnancy effects for the mother, increase the susceptibility to develop obesity and type 2 diabetes. And most of these chemicals lead to both obesity and diabetes. So diabetes is not always a consequence of obesity, okay? And they can produce diabetes directly. And well, the key to improve the situation is to decrease exposure and to change the regulation. And well, the good news, as Jerry Heindel wrote here, is that we can reduce exposure, but we need to work on that, and also the legislators need to work and, in order to have a new legislation to stop the production of metabolic disruptors. And thank you very much for your attention.